We are now entering into the wonderful, wacky world of human politics. Human politics as it's developed thus far over the centuries, or should I say, how it's degraded thus far in the last 100 years. Now, the one thing about politics we can say is that everything is politics, because politics is nothing more than the study of human interactions, relationships, and the hierarchies and balances this results in. We can also say that there is no mind without an ideology, whether this ideology is inherited, adopted from another, parroted, or is a product of the mind itself. Now, before we can go further, we must give a brief and hopefully concise overview. We have said in the past, and I'm repeating now, that the human mind works on a binary system, that is an on and off switch, a neurological switch, which simply designates a flow or no flow of bioenergy through the synaptic nerves and neural clusters within the mind, which creates thought. This on-off mechanism is simple, and that's why it evolves first. And this results in the dualism we experience today in everything from politics to philosophy. Now, to understand the dichotomies of right and left as they've been shaped over the centuries and are now defined, we must go back to the roots of these words. And I'm going to offer my opinion upon the roots of these words, these concepts. And they are always rooted in psychology, because after all, the tool being used in thinking is the human mind. And the human mind is fraught with emotions and instincts and predispositions and natural inclinations which it must overcome or understand or surrender to. Now, the left and right are rooted, in my opinion, in the fight and flight mechanism. Right is fight. The left is flight. And everything that corresponds to these two sides of the spectrum reflect this fight or flight. Therefore, the right political spectrum is the masculine. It is the fight reaction to reality, whereas the left is the feminine. It is the flight reaction to reality. As such, we can divide the right, or we can define the right as as we said, the fight, the masculine, and the tendency towards order. Now, order is never complete because everything is a becoming, and it's never a becomed. There's never a being. There's never an absolute. Everything is a fluid, a fluidity, a movement towards. So this is a movement towards order, which is a masculine movement. Now, from the left, on the left, we have the flight, the feminine, and which is a towards disorder. That is the natural tendency of the universe towards increasing entropy. That is increasing fragmentation, disordering. Now that we have a brief overview, which no doubt requires fleshing out, but since the medium doesn't permit me to do so, I will proceed to the subdivisions, again in brief. So now we have the right, which is fight, in the fight or flight mechanism. It's masculine, and it's a tendency towards order. This can be subdivided into two groups: absolute control and self-control. Absolute control is authoritarianism, totalitarianism, fascism, the idea of the God King or the God period. And this is a form of nihilism of the uniform something, where the some remains always ambiguous because the thing is never actually perceived, and so it always remains ambiguous. The second, of course, is self-control, which is related to Hellenism and paganism, and to the balanced ascetic, that is the balanced asceticism. On the other side, the left, we've said we have the flight mechanism in the fight or flight reaction to the world. This is feminine. It is a tendency towards disorder, a disordering, a surrender to the status quo, even if the left is associated with rebelliousness. In fact, it is conservative in that it simply surrenders to the status quo of nature, which is a constant disordering, an increase in entropy. Now, this left can be subdivided into two major groups. Denial, which can be either total or selective, and this is associated with escapism, hedonism, materialism, rejection of the sensual world, and rejection of empiricism, rejection of the self, the ego, the slandering of the ego, extreme relativism, that is, no perspective matters because it's all relative. And in the Eastern traditions, it's associated with emptiness, the Brahman, nirvana, or paradise as we know it here, the void, the absolute void. This is nihilism of the uniform no thing or nothing, and it stands in contradiction to the something, that is, they both assume a thing because the mind can only think in absolutes, and yet one acknowledges it but cannot define it, and so calls it something, whereas the other acknowledges it but cannot find it, and so calls it a no thing. The second and the left category is fatalism. This is characterized by a surrender to nature, self-pity, and extreme asceticism, that is, extreme denial of self. If we've understood what is being said, and if we're honest about it, then we will see that the vast array of political discourse, the different ideologies, the different theories, economic theories, theories of manipulating and controlling the masses, of organizing systems, social systems, can fall within one of these two major categories and four subcategories. In my essay called The Feminization of Man, I mentioned how today, particularly in the West, we are experiencing an increase in the feminine energy, which, again, we are reminded from what was said, is accompanied by a denial, total or selective, of reality, or a fatalism, that is, a surrender to the inevitable, which is again a feminine disposition. As femininity increases as a norm in power, becomes more popular, in other words, because feminism always relies on the feminine energy always relies on quantity rather than quality, then we have a reaction to it, which is extreme. That is, we get a right wing which is about absolute control, that is authoritarian, fascistic, totalitarianism, the religious dogma where a god king is proposed, that is an absolute masculine authority under which all other males must bow and kowtow to. We can see how Christianity here is the ultimate in emasculation, the ultimate form of emasculation, for beneath God no man can be anything but a boy, really, and not even his own son is worth more to him than his servitude to this God King. So we have this increase in feminine energy due to the decrease in resources and frontiers, accompanied by a slight yet distinctive increase in extreme masculinity, sometimes merely symbolic, whereas the more balanced form of masculinity, the Hellenic form, the pagan form, the balanced ascetic, is sort of diminished or forgotten. Having said that, we can now say that the masculine and the feminine coexist within each individual, and the degree that each manifests in the psychology of each individual determines whether this individual is masculine or feminine. This means that one can be born a biological male and still have a feminine disposition, be feminine in his thinking. The only thing the biology determines is the potential of a characteristic. That is, if we want to use an analogy, being born a man determines how much muscle you'll have, how much you will eventually and realistically develop in the course of your life. It's not determined by your biology. It's determined by you, by your will, by the circumstances. That means that a female might have more muscle than a male, even if her potential for having muscle is lower than a male's. This applies to everything, including intelligence between the races. That is, a Caucasian might have more potential of being intelligent than a non-Caucasian, but how much of this potential is developed is determined by the particulars of the individual plus the circumstances. Therefore, in the case of the masculine and the feminine dispositions, psychologies, it is easy to see how a woman can be much more masculine than a male, and a male can be much more feminine than a female. And this is what feminization means. It means an increase in the feminine qualities in both sexes. This should not be confused with the imitation, the mimicry, or the symbolic representation of masculinity, whereas the essence of masculinity is absent. So we can have a woman or a man appearing to be masculine and yet being very feminine. There are, of course, many secondary attitudes, sometimes elusive and hypocritical ones. For instance, on the right side of the spectrum, we have the tendency towards anarchy. That is, this attraction to the feminine disorder, or the feminine fragmentation, so as to eradicate the order that's already in existence, in the hopes that a new order will be established, one more preferable to the mind, advocating anarchy. On the other side, we have an attraction to the masculine order as a way of speeding up the process towards disorganization and fragmentation. For example, the feminine disposition would be seduced by the more masculine order in order to immerse itself within its authority, and so find there its void, so to speak. This is if you use Nietzschean metaphors, this is a will to power using a different route. This is the will to power through association. these tendencies will not only fluctuate between biological forms, such as male-female, but may fluctuate between age groups. That is, an older individual who has invested more in the system will become more right-wing, that is, will advocate order, whereas an individual who is younger or who has less to lose will tend towards the left, where it hopes that any change will be for the better. In general, we see on the right side a rebelliousness towards nature. Even though they're called conservative, they're really the rebels in this case. A resistance towards nature, a tendency to fight rather than flee. Whereas on the left, we see the opposite. We see a conservation of the status quo, which is a increase in entropy, which requires no effort, by the way, whereas resistance requires effort. And so we see this tendency towards flight, either into artificial realities and to hope for alternative worlds, paradise, utopias, fantasy, or through a total denial of self. In the more honest forms of the feminine side, we see a total nihilistic tendency, a desire to destroy the world, to, in essence, explode it and return it to a uniform nothing.